In the quest for the perfect travel computer, there is a new challenger. The M1 MacBook Pro 14 has stepped up to try and claim the crown from the current monarch, the M1 MacBook Air. Now, we already made a video similar to this speaking about a hypothetical M1 Max MacBook Pro 14 before the computers were released. However, now that we've got them both in hand, time to finalize those comparisons. The M1 MacBook Air is the absolute best travel computer ever made. It's very well priced, relatively powerful, has amazing battery life, and weighs almost nothing. That won't be an easy hurdle for the 14 to overcome. Now, it would be very easy to say, hey, the MacBook Pro 14 can be kitted out to have the M1 Max processor, so it wins by default. But that's boring. And I think there's a more interesting conversation to be had from a price to performance perspective, because not everything in life is as simple as, hey, let's spend $5,000 and see what happens. That's the best, right? So which of these comes out on top? Let's find out. What's up, everyone? I'm the Everyday Dad, and if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. I didn't slam these because it's really hard to, once you get them set into the right, shininess level, it's hard to get them back there after you, slam the lid. Right off the bat, I do want to say that I like both of these computers, and honestly, when we sit right down to it, and when we ask which of these is the best portable computer, I'd have to give it to both of them. They are both so good in their own right that there isn't anything else in the market that comes close to either of these, not by a wide margin. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna figure out some nuances and who each of these computers might work better for, because just remember, they're both fantastic. The good news is there is no wrong answer today. And I think the most important place to start is by comparing the price. That's probably where the biggest point of discussion about the differences today will be. The M1 MacBook Air comes in at a base model price of $999. For that money, you'll get the 8-core M1 processor, 7-core GPU, 8 gigabytes of unified memory, and a 256 gigabyte solid-state drive. As of the making of this video, you could also get the MacBook Air refurbished from Apple for $849 for that base model if they're in stock. If not, keep checking back because the Apple refurbished store seems to update almost daily. You don't get a lot of options for customization here, with your only options available being unified memory and the hard drive respectively, and you can take those to an upgraded 16 gigabytes of unified memory and a 2 terabyte solid state drive. Plus, and I hope you're sitting down for this, you have an option to get an additional GPU core. That MacBook Air is in the big leagues now. Those upgrades bring that demure starting price up to $2,049 brand new, or $1,749 if you are buying it refurbished. Fam, I'm telling you, the refurbished store is the best thing that Apple does. On the other hand, the base model MacBook Pro 14 comes in at $1,999, which is the biggest downside to the computer overall, as we'll see going forward. For that base model, you'll get the 8-core M1 Pro processor, 14-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of unified memory, and a 512 gigabyte solid-state drive. Here, you will get a ton more customization options, though. You'll get higher-end processors, more unified memory, more storage, like an actual crazy amount of storage. 8 terabytes in a portable travel laptop. That's legitimately shocking. I won't go through every option here because I've done that in previous videos, but if we were to take this laptop to its extreme conclusion, that would be a 10-core M1 Max processor, 32-core GPU, 64 gigabytes of unified memory, and that insane 8 terabyte solid-state drive. This would cost us $58.99, or insert motorcycle joke here. That's 3.2 of those maxed out MacBook Airs, by the way. Normally, I only concern myself and talk about base models in these videos, but I know a lot of folks want me to compare things as apples to apples as I can get. So the price that I want you to keep in your head for the MacBook Air today is gonna be one that's spec'd to as closely resemble the base model MacBook Pro 14 as possible, and that will come to $1499 for a 16 gigabyte unified memory, 512 gigabyte storage option, which again, if you bring in the Apple refurbished store, that drops that price down to $1189. That was a lot of talk about pricing, but I do think that that's what's going to end up being the most important point of discussion today. If the prices were even across the board, I think it's much easier to go with the MacBook Pro 14 because objectively, as we'll see here in a second, it beats the MacBook Air in almost every category. But does it do so enough to warrant that almost double price tag? There is another aspect that I think is as big of a decider as the price, but I want to save that for a little bit later because I think some folks might have the wrong assumptions that need to be corrected about things like power. So let's talk about the processors. Yes, both of these have some version of an 8-core M1 SoC, or system on chip, but they aren't exactly built the same. The MacBook Air will come with the 8-core M1 standard processor which is built with 4 efficiency and 4 high performance cores, where the M1 Pro inside of the MacBook Pro 14 is built with 2 efficiency and 6 high performance cores. Yes, the M1 Pro processor is objectively more powerful than the M1 standard processor, but it's not by that much. If we look at a standard CPU comparison tool, for this I used Cinebench R23, you can see that the MacBook Pro 14 running the M1 Pro did come in at almost 2,000 points higher than the M1 standard in the multi-core performance test. You see a lot of multi-core tests because it's easier to show differences in chips that way, but a lot of standard computer use is not a multi-threaded task. Examples of multi-threaded tasks are things like video editing, bulk photo editing, having a ton of open tabs in a browser at any given time, things that you need your CPU to bring a wider amount of power to bear instead of a deeper amount of power. I know that's not a perfect explanation, but that'll do for a channel called The Everyday Dad. If you're looking for more, I would recommend The Everyday Processor Explainer Person for a more in-depth analysis. When we look at what a regular person's computer will be doing more often, those are single core tasks, those that need deeper amounts of power that I mentioned earlier. Gaming, watching videos, working on office type products, scrolling Reddit. When you look at that, the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro score almost the exact same. Yes, at the time that I ran these tests, there was a 20-point difference favoring the 14-inch MacBook, but team, that's not a big enough difference to warrant $1,000. Even in a more real world, or as real world as I can show you in a video without you watching me yell at PowerPoint for 8 hours a day, in a real world video editing render test, the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro 14 were only around 13 seconds different. Sure, that can add up over time, but we say that a lot. Let's put some actual numbers to that. Let's say you are the Everyday Dad, welcome Gary, and you release 3 videos a week here on YouTube. Let's say that you also make $15 an hour in your day job. That 13 seconds difference will happen 156 times over the course of a year, adding up to 2,028 seconds. Ooh, that sounds 2,028 seconds. That sounds like a lot, which is actually like 33 minutes or $7 to $8 of lost revenue. That's not nothing, but I'm not sure that ROI comes close to the double price tag of the MacBook Pro 14. Math. You made me do math today. Power-wise, the new M1 Pros sound cooler, and they sound like they are more powerful, and yes, they are objectively more powerful, and are far more powerful at the higher levels. But if you were getting the base model, there is just not that much of a practical, usable difference between the generations of tech. Certainly not enough of a difference to warrant such a high price disparity. I know that's not a very popular statement to make here on YouTube, but them's the breaks. So power-wise, I think it's kind of a draw, but honestly, the biggest difference and the deciding factor for me is the physical layout and the port upgrades across the two computers. The MacBook Air is built off of an older generation of Macs based on the 2016 design, and it hasn't seen an upgrade in a couple of years. You get 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports and a headphone jack. That's it. And yes, that kinda sucks. Those Thunderbolt 3 ports will allow you to connect out to one 6K display if you want, and can also work with a whole range of accessories if you do want to turn this into a hybrid computer. But the biggest negative I have around this whole thing from a versatility standpoint is you will need at least some kind of an adapter or a dongle to make this work in more than one situation. But looking over at the MacBook Pro 14, it's like everything was fixed all at once. You get 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 1 HDMI 2.0 port, an SD card reader, and that headphone jack. So right off the bat, you can already connect out to a 4K display with no additional adapter needed through the HDMI port built right into the laptop. But wait, it gets so much better. With this base model, you can actually do 2 6K displays from the Thunderbolt 4 port and a 4K display from the HDMI. And you can add 1 6K display if you were to go with the M1 Max processor option. This right here is the difference maker for me. Yes, there is more that we'll talk about displays and cameras and such, but I'm a pretty practical person. I don't exactly care that much about how things look. I care, but it's not the primary decider for me, especially, again, with these price disparities. Needing to carry around less stuff to make my computers work for me instead of me having to work to get my computers right, that's all the difference in the world. The SD card slot, that's also cool, and I use it a ton, but that only really gets used for YouTube work and not my day job. My day job loves the HDMI port though, so don't take that away again. Please. Yes, the MacBook Pro 14 is a little bit bigger, but it's not that much bigger compared to what I thought it would be. Physically, it has a more blocky design and is a little thicker compared to the previous MacBook Pro 13, but that's what allows for all of the new ports. The keyboards on both are fantastic, easily the best on any laptop, period. It is essentially the same keyboard across the same, except the MacBook Pro has a sleek new contrasting design with the lights and the darks as opposed to the aluminum across the board look of the MacBook Air. When it comes to actual typing though, I prefer typing on the MacBook Air, mainly because of the shape of the body of the computer. The MacBook Air has this slight wedge shape to it, so the keyboard is like sloping down as you type on it. This makes it far more comfortable than the rather sharp edge of the MacBook Pro 14. Yes, you can easily get work done on the 14. I have done a ton of it personally, but it can get uncomfortable after a while. Like when you get those little dents in your arms from the edges here, I've not had that same problem on the Air. Too much wedge would make it awkward, but a little bit of an angle, that makes all the difference. Okay, let's get into another of the huge differences. The displays on both are almost like they're from two separate planets. The MacBook Air has a decent Retina panel that can go up to 400 nits of brightness. The MacBook Pro 14 has like a super XDR Retina panel that has a ton of tricks up its sleeves. 1, it has a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio. 2, it can go up to 120 Hz refresh rate. 3, it can display a billion colors. This display is hands down the most gorgeous I've ever seen on a laptop. Something that I do want to make a clarification on is while Apple states that this will go up to 1,000 nits of sustained brightness, I got a lot of comments on previous videos that in actuality, even though it does go up to 1,600 nits for max HDR brightness, 1,000 nits is not something you'll get in normal use. Well, I didn't know, so I put that to the test by buying an actual Klein Tools light meter, and yes, the max lux reading I could get, which lux is not the exact same as nits, but it's close enough for an overview. The max LUTs reading that I could get was in the high 400s. So it's essentially a 500 nits panel most of the time. Maybe there is some kind of super bright setting, but I wasn't able to find it. Back to the comparison, except there isn't really one here. The MacBook Pro 14 has objectively the best screen, not only against the MacBook Air, but against all computers. And the last comparison I want to make quickly is a very important one for me. That's battery life. The two computers have very similar battery life according to the Apple website. 18 for the MacBook Air, 17 for the MacBook Pro 14. That's awesome, leading to both of these computers easily clearing my hurdle for a full day of use. If we were to get into it a little deeper between the two computers, I do think the MacBook Air has the better life. I don't do in-depth tests on battery life, I just use computers as I normally would and see how it fares for me in use. The MacBook Pro just feels like it eats through a battery a little faster. It's not a deal breaker, and it's certainly not as bad as previous Intel Macs or some of my Windows laptops, but if you need the absolute best longevity out of a laptop, I've got to give it to the MacBook Air, because much like the MacBook Pro 13, this never seems to run out of battery life. But at the end of the day, so what, right? Now that we've actually got our hands on these computers, which one comes out on top? That's not as easy as it might have initially sounded. Personally, I think the purchase decider will come down to what you need the computer to do. If you just need a laptop to get work done and you don't really want a hybrid do-it-all machine, the MacBook Air continues to reign supreme. It's got the power, it's got the price, it's got the size, it's got the battery life. It continues to be a perfect example of what an Ultrabook laptop can be. But if you do want to have more connections, the new MacBook Pro design is fantastic. More external monitors, more customization options, more ports, better display, better almost everything, except that it's going to cost you. I'd probably go with the MacBook Pro 14 simply because of that HDMI port, but if that HDMI port was not on the body of this computer, I would continue to stick with the MacBook Air. Like I said in the beginning of the video, thankfully, there is no wrong choice, as both of these are fantastic computers, and you can't go wrong. And if you like this video and you want to see what I think is the perfect desk setup for the MacBook Pro 14, I've got a video that you can find for that topic by clicking right here. Click, 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 click. Thanks for watching.